The sparks from my welding torch danced across the metal like angry fireflies as I put the finishing touches on Sophie's anniversary gift. 10 years of marriage deserved something special, something that came from the heart and my calloused hands. The sculpture was a twisted piece of beauty, abstract curves that reminded me of how we used to dance in our tiny first apartment, back when she actually smiled at my jokes. I heard the front door slam, followed by the sharp click of designer heels on our hardwood floors. Sophie was home from another late meeting at the gallery, and judging by the way she stumbled slightly, she'd already been sampling the wine at whatever artsy event she'd attended without me. "Danny?" Her voice carried that familiar edge of irritation, like I was already disappointing her, just by existing in our own house. "In the workshop, babe," I called back, setting down my torch and pulling off my safety mask. Sweat dripped down my forehead as I admired my work. The metal gleamed under the harsh workshop lights, every curve polished to perfection. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her black cocktail dress immaculate despite the wine on her breath. At 38, she was still stunning, the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. Too bad she'd stopped turning her head toward me years ago. "What's all this noise? I have a headache," she said, not even glancing at the sculpture. Actually, perfect timing. I wiped my hands on a rag and gestured toward my creation. "Happy anniversary, Soph. I know it's not until tomorrow, but I couldn't wait." She looked at the sculpture like I'd just presented her with a pile of scrap from a demolition site. Her perfectly manicured fingers traced the air around it without actually touching the metal. "It's very you," she said finally. "Rough around the edges." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "Took me 3 weeks to get those curves just right. The gallery owner you work for, Mrs. Barlow, she'd probably appreciate the craftsmanship. Maybe you could show it to her?" Sophie's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Danny, sweetie, Mrs. Barlow deals in real art, not handmade junk from someone's garage workshop." She picked up the sculpture with 2 fingers, like it might contaminate her. "I don't want this cluttering up our house." Before I could respond, she walked over to our kitchen trash can and dropped it in with a metallic clang that echoed through my chest. "Sophie, what the heck? I'm tired, Danny. I'm going to bed. And please keep the noise down tomorrow. Some of us have important work to do." She clicked away, leaving me standing there like an idiot, staring at 10 years of marriage and 3 weeks of work sitting in the garbage next to coffee grounds and takeout containers. I didn't argue. I didn't chase after her. I just stood there for a long moment, listening to her heels on the stairs, then the slam of our bedroom door. Some folks have no taste, I thought, fishing my sculpture out of the trash. I wiped off a piece of lettuce and carried it back to my workshop where it belonged. The next morning, I decided to walk downtown instead of driving to my regular job at Peterson's Metalworks. I needed the air, needed to clear my head after another night of sleeping on the couch, while Sophie snored in our bed like nothing had happened. Main Street was buzzing with the usual mix of college students, tourists, and locals pretending they had somewhere important to be. I was passing Barlow Contemporary Arts when something in the window display stopped me cold. My sculpture, my anniversary gift, my 3 weeks of work. It sat on a white pedestal under professional lighting, with a small placard that read, "Untitled for 47, Contemporary Mixed Media, 12,000. "Son of a witch," I whispered, pressing my face against the glass. "Magnificent piece, isn't it?" a familiar voice said behind me. I turned to see Sophie walking up the sidewalk, arm in arm with Ethan Morrison. I knew Ethan from the few gallery events Sophie had dragged me to. He was her business associate, a lawyer who supposedly helped with contracts and acquisitions. Tall, silver-haired, expensive suit kind of guy. The kind who probably had never worked with his hands a day in his life. "The artist has such raw talent," Sophie continued, not noticing me yet. "Very primitive, masculine. It speaks to something primal, don't you think?" Ethan squeezed her arm. "You have such an eye for discovering new talent, darling. Mrs. Barlow is lucky to have you." That's when Sophie saw me. Her face went white, then red, then settled on a sickly shade of embarrassment. "Danny, what are you doing downtown?" "Admiring the local art," I said, nodding toward the window. "That's a beautiful piece. Very familiar." Ethan extended a manicured hand. "Ethan Morrison. I don't think we've met properly." I shook his hand, making sure to squeeze just hard enough to remind him what calluses felt like. Danny Chen, Sophie's husband, the guy who made that sculpture you're admiring. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Sophie's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I can explain, she started. No need, I said, still smiling. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for how my anniversary gift ended up in a gallery window with a $12,000 price tag. Ethan cleared his throat. Well, this is awkward. Sophie, perhaps we should— Yeah, you should, I interrupted. You should definitely do that. I walked away before either of them could respond, my hands shaking with rage. But underneath the anger was something else. A cold, calculating feeling I'd never experienced before. Sophie had crossed a line, and she was going to learn what happened when you threw away something precious. That evening I sat in Murphy's Tavern nursing a beer and waiting for my best friend Ray to show up. Ray owned the place, a dive bar that catered to construction workers, mechanics, and other folks who actually worked for a living. The kind of place Sophie wouldn't be caught dead in. You look like someone pissed in your cornflakes, Ray said, sliding into the booth across from me. At 45, Ray was built like the boxer he used to be. Thick shoulders, scarred knuckles, and a nose that had been broken at least 3 times. Worse, Sophie sold my anniversary gift. Ray's eyebrows shot up. The sculpture you've been working on? Threw it in the trash, then somehow it ended up in her gallery with a $12,000 price tag. Jesus, Danny, that's cold even for her. I took a long pull from my beer. You remember that night last week when you called and Sophie said I was out? Yeah, you were supposedly at some hardware store. I was here, with you, playing pool until midnight. Ray's expression darkened. So she lied about where you were? Question is, why? Because she was somewhere she shouldn't have been, with someone she shouldn't have been with. The lawyer guy? Ethan, what's his face? Morrison. Yeah, probably. Ray leaned back in his booth, studying me. What are you going to do about it? I don't know yet, but I'm done being the fool who sleeps on his own couch. You want my advice? Get proof before you do anything stupid. Sophie's smart, and she's got connections. You go off half-cocked, she'll take you to the cleaners in divorce court. I'm not going to do anything stupid, Ray, but I'm also not going to do nothing. The next few days passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Sophie acted like nothing had happened, chattering about gallery business over breakfast while I nodded and made appropriate sounds. She didn't mention the sculpture, and neither did I. But something fundamental had shifted between us, like a gear that had slipped and would never quite mesh properly again. On Thursday night, Sophie announced she was working late again, some important client dinner that required her personal attention. She kissed my cheek with lips that tasted like lies and walked out the door in a dress that cost more than most people's rent. I waited exactly 10 minutes before following her. Sophie's silver BMW led me through downtown to Chez Laurent, the kind of French restaurant where they serve portions the size of poker chips and charge accordingly. I parked across the street and watched through the large windows as she was seated at a corner table. She wasn't alone. Ethan Morrison slid into the seat across from her, leaning forward to take her hand across the white tablecloth. Even from a distance, I could see this wasn't a business dinner. This was 2 people who knew each other's bodies, who had shared secrets and morning coffee, and probably my bed while I was at work. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The camera wasn't great in low light, but it captured enough. Sophie laughing at something Ethan said. Ethan's thumb stroking her knuckles, the way they leaned into each other like teenagers on a first date. After dinner, they walked to the alley beside the restaurant. I got out of my truck and crept closer, staying in the shadows between parked cars. That's when I got the money shot. Ethan pressing Sophie against the brick wall, her arms around his neck, kissing like the world was ending. I snapped 3 pictures before my hands started shaking too badly to hold the phone steady. But I wasn't done watching. They separated, talked quietly for a few minutes, then walked toward the parking garage. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it echoing off the concrete walls. That's when I saw Ethan's car, a pristine black Porsche that probably cost more than I made in 2 years. It sat under a security light like a monument to everything I wasn't. Sophie and Ethan were too busy groping each other beside the car to notice me approach. I pulled out my keys and dragged them along the driver's side, leaving a jagged scar in the perfect paint job. Nice paint job, Ethan, I whispered to myself. Shame about the scratches. I was almost back to the stairwell when I heard it, The mechanical whir of a security camera turning to track my movement. The red recording light blinked like an accusation. Crap, I breathed, and ran. The next morning, Sophie was already gone when I woke up on the couch. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Working late again tonight, don't wait up. S. No love you, no have a good day. Just instructions like I was a houseplant she needed to water occasionally. I called in sick to work and spent the morning researching private investigators online. Most of them looked like they'd learned their trade from watching too much television, but one stood out. Glenn Kowalski, a former cop who specialized in domestic situations requiring discretion. His office was above a bail bondsman in the sketchy part of downtown, the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business and asked no questions. Glenn himself looked like Central Casting's idea of a private detective. Rumpled suit, 3-day stubble, eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. Marriage problems? He asked, not looking up from the file he was reading. You could say that. My wife is having an affair. You want proof for divorce proceedings? I want to know what I'm dealing with, how long it's been going on, how serious it is, whether there's more to it than just love. Glenn finally looked up. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 55, with intelligent eyes and hands that stayed perfectly still on his desk. My rate is $500 a day plus expenses. I'll need a retainer of $1,500 up front. And Mr. Chen, Danny Chen. Mr. Chen, I have to ask, what are you planning to do with whatever information I find? I don't know yet, but I'm tired of being the only one in my marriage who doesn't know what's going on. Glenn nodded slowly. Fair enough. Give me a week. That night, Sophie came home at 11:30, claiming she'd been at a gallery opening in Boston. She smelled like expensive cologne that wasn't mine and had a small bruise on her neck that she tried to cover with makeup. How was Boston? I asked from the kitchen where I was pretending to read the newspaper. Exhausting. Lots of networking. You know how it is. I really don't. Tell me about it. She paused in the doorway, studying my face. Why the sudden interest in my work? Can't a husband be curious about his wife's career? Since when? The words came out sharper than she'd intended. She softened her tone. I mean, you've never shown much interest in the art world before. Maybe I'm expanding my horizons, learning to appreciate finer things. Sophie's laugh was brittle. Danny, honey, you're a metal worker. You make functional things, gates, railings, repairs. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not art. It's craft work. What's the difference? Art transcends its medium. It speaks to something higher in the human experience. Craft work is just useful. I nodded thoughtfully. So my sculpture in Mrs. Barlow's window, that's art or craft work. The color drained from her face. That's different. How? It just is, Danny. Can we please not do this now? I'm tired. She left me sitting in the kitchen, wondering when my wife had become a stranger who spoke in art school cliches and looked at me like I was something she'd stepped in. 3 days later, Glenn called with his preliminary report. We met at a diner near the interstate, the kind of place where truckers and insomniacs gathered to drink coffee that could strip paint. Your wife is definitely having an affair, Glenn said without preamble, sliding a manila envelope across the Formica table. But it's more complicated than that. The envelope contained photographs, Sophie and Ethan at restaurants, hotels, his apartment. But there were also documents. Financial records, gallery invoices, correspondence between Sophie and several art dealers I'd never heard of. Ethan Morrison isn't just sleeping with your wife, Glenn continued. They're running a con game through the gallery, fake provenance documents, inflated appraisals, works sold to multiple buyers. It's sophisticated stuff. My sculpture? It's probably a test run, something to see if they could move local work through their network without raising suspicions. I stared at a photograph of Sophie and Ethan kissing in front of his apartment building. How long has this been going on? The affair? Maybe 8 months. The art fraud? At least 2 years, possibly longer. Your wife is very good at this, Mr. Chen, and very careful. Except for the sculpture. That was arrogance. She thought you'd never find out. And even if you did, what could you do about it? I closed the envelope and finished my coffee. What would you do, Glenn, if this was your wife? I'd be very careful about my next move. These people have money, connections, and lawyers. They also have a lot to lose, which makes them dangerous. More dangerous than a pissed-off husband with nothing left to lose? Glenn's smile was grim. We'll find out, won't we? That night, I sat in my workshop surrounded by half-finished projects and tried to figure out what kind of man I wanted to be. The old Danny would have confronted Sophie directly, demanded explanations, maybe thrown some dishes. The old Danny would have been hurt and angry and ultimately powerless. But the old Danny hadn't known his wife was a thief and a liar who saw him as nothing more than a useful fool. I picked up my welding torch and lit it, watching the blue flame dance in the darkness. Sophie wanted to see what I was capable of creating? Fine, but she was about to learn I was even better at destroying things. The first step was reconnaissance. I needed to understand Sophie's world before I could tear it down, so I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. Her phone calls, her schedule, the names she dropped at dinner. Mrs. Eleanor Barlow was the key. At 72, she was the undisputed queen of the local art scene, with connections that reached from Boston to New York. She'd built her reputation on discovering new talent and had an ego the size of Massachusetts. More importantly, she trusted Sophie completely. That trust was about to become a liability. I spent my lunch breaks that week visiting other galleries, coffee shops, and restaurants where the art crowd gathered. I listened to gossip, learned the politics, and discovered that Mrs. Barlow's biggest fear was being made to look foolish in front of her peers. Perfect. On Friday evening, Sophie announced she was attending a gallery opening for some sculptor from Vermont. She spent an hour getting ready, choosing a red dress that clung to her curves and made her look like trouble in high heels. "You look beautiful," I said as she checked her reflection one final time. She seemed surprised by the compliment. "Thank you. Don't wait up. These things usually run late." "Will Ethan be there?" The question caught her off guard. "Probably. He represents several of the artists. Maybe I should come with you. Support my wife's career." "Danny, you'd be bored out of your mind. It's just a bunch of art people talking about art things." "I might surprise you. I've been reading about contemporary sculpture lately." Something flickered in her eyes, fear maybe, or calculation. "That's sweet, but I'll be working. Networking. You'd just be standing around by yourself." "If you're sure, I'm sure." She kissed my cheek and left, trailing expensive perfume and lies. I waited 20 minutes, then drove to the gallery. The opening was in full swing. Dozens of people in black clothing drinking wine and pretending to understand what they were looking at. I parked across the street and watched through the windows. Sophie was in her element, gliding between groups with a wine glass in her hand and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She introduced people to each other, whispered in ears, laughed at jokes that probably weren't funny. She was good at this, better than I'd realized. Ethan arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that drew attention from across the room. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my truck, and he moved through the crowd like he owned it. When he reached Sophie, he didn't kiss her or touch her inappropriately. He was smarter than that. But I could see the electricity between them, the way they leaned into each other's space. I took more pictures, building my collection of evidence. Around 10 o'clock, I watched Sophie and Ethan slip away from the main gallery into a back room. I gave them 5 minutes, then called the gallery's main number from my cell phone. "Barlow Contemporary Arts, this is Jennifer." "Hi, I'm trying to reach Sophie Chen. I believe she's at your opening tonight." "Oh, I just saw her a few minutes ago. Let me find her for you." I watched through the window as a young woman in black searched the main gallery, then disappeared toward the back rooms. A few minutes later, she returned and picked up the phone. "I'm sorry, I can't seem to locate Mrs. Chen right now. Can I take a message?" "That's okay. I'll try her cell phone." "Thanks." I hung up and waited. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, Sophie and Ethan emerged from the back room, both looking slightly disheveled. Sophie's lipstick was gone and Ethan's tie was crooked. The next morning, I found Sophie's second cell phone. She'd hidden it in her jewelry box, buried under necklaces she never wore. It was a cheap prepaid phone, the kind people used when they didn't want calls traced back to them. The text message history was illuminating. "Ethan, can't wait to taste you again." Sophie, "Danny's working late tomorrow. Come over at 8. Ethan, "What about the Chen problem?" Sophie, "What about it? He's harmless." Ethan, "Are you sure? He seems suspicious at the restaurant." Sophie, "Danny's too stupid to figure anything out. Trust me." Ethan, "If you say so, but we need to be more careful. After the Barlow deal goes through, we won't have to worry about him anymore." Ethan, "You sure you want to go through with it?" Sophie, "I'm tired of pretending to love someone I can barely stand." I read the messages 3 times, each word hitting like a physical blow. 10 years of marriage reduced to the Chen problem. A decade of shared meals, shared dreams, shared bed, and I was just an obstacle to be managed. But the last exchange was the most interesting. Sophie. Barlow's planning to retire next year. She's looking for someone to take over the gallery, Ethan. And that someone is you, Sophie. With the right backing, yes. Your investor contacts plus my reputation, Ethan. What about your husband? Won't he expect half of everything in a divorce? Sophie, only if there's anything left to split. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it and went to my workshop. I had some planning to do. Glenn's second report arrived on Monday. The art fraud was bigger than we'd initially thought. Sophie and Ethan had been running scams through 3 different galleries, moving fake pieces and inflated appraisals through a network that stretched from Maine to Virginia. They'd made at least $200,000 in the past year alone. But the most interesting discovery was about Mrs. Barlow herself. The old woman was clean. She had no idea what was happening in her own gallery. Sophie had been forging documents, manipulating sales records, and skimming money right under her nose. The beauty of it is the trust factor, Glenn explained over coffee. Barlow thinks Sophie is like a daughter to her. She's given her complete access to everything, finances, client lists, authentication records. Sophie could have cleaned her out completely if she'd wanted to. Why didn't she? Because she wanted the whole gallery, not just the money. She's been positioning herself as Barlow's successor while simultaneously setting up the old woman to take the fall for the fraud. Meaning, when this comes out, and it will come out eventually, all the evidence will point to Barlow as the mastermind. Sophie will look like an innocent employee who was fooled along with everyone else. I stared into my coffee cup, thinking about the woman I'd married. She's smarter than I gave her credit for. Smart enough to fool a lot of people, but not smart enough to cover all her tracks. What do you mean? Glenn smiled. She kept records, detailed records. I think part of her enjoyed documenting how clever she was being. Pride goeth before the fall, as they say. That evening, I made my first move. I called Mrs. Barlow's home number, which I'd found in Sophie's address book. The old woman answered on the 3rd ring, her voice crisp despite the late hour. Mrs. Barlow, this is Danny Chen, Sophie's husband. Oh, hello, Danny. How nice to hear from you. Is everything all right? I hope so. I was wondering if I could ask you something confidential about the gallery's authentication process. There was a pause. That's rather unusual, Danny. May I ask why you're interested? I've been doing some research into art fraud for a project I'm working on. I was curious about how galleries protect themselves from fake pieces. Well, it's quite complex. We have several layers of verification: provenance documentation, expert appraisals, sometimes scientific analysis. Why do you ask? I've been reading about cases where employees were involved in fraud. How would a gallery owner protect against that? Another pause, longer this time. Danny, is there something specific you're concerned about? Probably nothing, just curious about the business side of things. Sophie talks about her work, but I don't always understand the details. I see. Well, I can assure you that I trust my employees completely. Sophie, in particular, has been invaluable to me. I don't know what I'd do without her. I'm sure she'd be happy to hear that. Thank you for indulging my curiosity, Mrs. Barlow. Of course, dear. Give my regards to Sophie. I hung up and smiled. The seed was planted. Now I just had to wait for it to grow. The next night was Sophie's regular late meeting with Ethan. I followed them to his apartment, a converted warehouse in the trendy part of downtown. They were inside for 3 hours, and when Sophie finally emerged, her hair was messed up and she was carrying her shoes. I waited until she drove away, then walked up to Ethan's precious Porsche. This time, I came prepared. The sugar went into the gas tank. The spray paint spelled out "thief" across the hood in bright red letters. And the final touch, I used my welding skills to create a small metal sculpture, a twisted piece that looked like 2 bodies intertwined, and welded it to his roof. Let him explain that to his insurance company. The war began in earnest on a Tuesday morning when Sophie discovered that our joint checking account was empty. Danny, her voice carried from the kitchen with the force of a hurricane. What happened to our money? I looked up from my newspaper, the picture of innocent confusion. What do you mean? Our account. It's empty. Completely empty. That's weird. I made a deposit yesterday. I frowned as if trying to solve a puzzle. Did you check the savings account? That's empty too. Huh. Maybe there's been some kind of mistake. You should call the bank. Sophie's face was turning an interesting shade of red. Danny, where's our money? I moved it. You what? I opened a new account. at a different bank. Seemed like the responsible thing to do. Without telling me? I'm telling you now. For a moment, I thought she might actually hit me. Her hands were clenched into fists, and there was homicide in her eyes. But Sophie was too smart to lose control completely. "You can't do that," she said through gritted teeth. "That's my money, too." "You're absolutely right. We should split everything 50-50, as soon as you explain where the $12,000 from my sculpture went." The anger drained from her face, replaced by something much more dangerous: calculation. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. My anniversary gift that ended up in Mrs. Barlow's window. The one that sold last week, according to the gallery's website." "Danny, you're being paranoid." "Am I? Then you won't mind if I call Mrs. Barlow and ask her about it?" "You can't," she caught herself. "You can't bother Mrs. Barlow with something so trivial." $12,000 isn't trivial to me, Sophie. But then again, I'm just a metal worker. What do I know about money? She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her reassessing everything she thought she knew about her stupid husband. "We need to talk," she said finally. "I'm listening. Not here, tonight. After I get home from work." "Another late meeting?" "Yes, actually, with Mrs. Barlow, about gallery business." "Of course it is." After Sophie left, I called Glenn with an update. "She's rattled, and she's going to talk to Ethan about what to do next." "You sure you want to push this hard? Once you cross certain lines, there's no going back." "She crossed the line when she threw away 10 years of marriage for a lawyer with a fancy car." "Fair enough. What's your next move?" "I'm going to give Mrs. Barlow something to really worry about." That afternoon, I visited the gallery during Mrs. Barlow's usual tea time. The old woman received visitors in her private office, a cluttered space filled with art books and photographs of her with various celebrities. "Danny, what a pleasant surprise. Would you care for some tea?" "That's very kind, Mrs. Barlow. I was hoping I could ask you about something." "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" I pulled out a folder containing some of Glenn's research: financial records, sales documentation, correspondence between Sophie and various dealers. "I've been trying to surprise Sophie for our anniversary," I began. "I thought I might commission a piece from one of the artists she's been working with. But when I looked into some of these transactions, I found some irregularities." Mrs. Barlow's teacup rattled against its saucer. "What kind of irregularities?" "Well, for instance, this piece here." I pointed to a sales record. "It shows as sold to 3 different buyers in the same month, and this authentication document appears to have been backdated." The color drained from the old woman's face as she studied the papers. "Where did you get these?" "I hired a private investigator to help me research Sophie's work. I wanted to understand her world better, but now I'm worried that someone might be taking advantage of your trust. Sophie would never—" "I hope you're right, but maybe you should look into it, quietly, just to be safe." I left Mrs. Barlow sitting in her office, staring at the evidence of Sophie's betrayal. The old woman had built her reputation over 5 decades, and the thought of being made a fool of would eat at her like acid. That evening, Sophie came home in a rage. "What did you say to Mrs. Barlow?" "I told her I was proud of my wife's success." "Don't lie to me, Danny. She's asking questions about sales records, authentication documents. She wants to audit everything I've worked on for the past 2 years. Sounds like she's being thorough. That's good business practice. This is your doing. I don't know how, but you're behind this." I looked up from my dinner, leftover pizza, since Sophie had been too busy scheming to cook. "You give me too much credit. I'm just a metal worker, remember? Too stupid to figure anything out." The recognition in her eyes was almost worth everything I'd been through. She finally understood that harmless husband had been paying attention. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want my wife back. The woman I married. The one who used to love me. Danny. But since that woman apparently never existed, I'll settle for the truth." Sophie sat down across from me, and for a moment she looked like the girl I'd fallen in love with 15 years ago. Vulnerable, uncertain, human. "It's complicated," she said. "Uncomplicated. Ethan and we didn't plan for this to happen." "Which part? The affair or the art fraud?" Her face went white. "How do you—" "I know about the fake authentication documents. I know about the multiple sales of single pieces. I know about the money you've been skimming from Mrs. Barlow. And I know that you've been planning to frame her for all of it." Sophie stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "That's impossible. There's no way you could know." "I also know about the second cell phone. The one where you and Ethan discuss the Chen problem and how I'm too stupid to figure anything out." She was quiet for a long time, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl called to the principal's office. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. "That depends on you." "What do you mean?" "You have a choice, Sophie. You can come clean, confess to Mrs. Barlow, return the money you've stolen, end things with Ethan, and try to save our marriage. Or you can keep lying, keep stealing, and see what happens next. And if I choose option 2, I smiled, and something in my expression made her lean back in her chair. "Then you'll find out what happens when you underestimate someone you think is harmless." The next morning, Sophie made her choice. I woke up to find a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to Boston for a few days. Need time to think. Don't follow me. S." But Sophie wasn't in Boston. Glenn's surveillance showed her at Ethan's apartment, and by evening they were loading suitcases into his car. They were running, which meant they knew the walls were closing in. Time for the final act. Mrs. Barlow's gallery opening for a new exhibition was scheduled for Friday night, the perfect venue for what I had planned. The cream of local society would be there, along with art critics, collectors, and everyone who mattered in Sophie's world. I spent Thursday preparing my presentation. Glenn had provided me with copies of everything: financial records, forged documents, email correspondence, photographs of Sophie and Ethan together. I organized it all into a comprehensive portfolio that told the complete story of their fraud. Friday evening, I put on my best suit, the one I'd worn to our wedding, and drove to the gallery. The opening was everything I'd expected: pretentious people drinking expensive wine and discussing the emotional resonance of paintings that looked like someone had sneezed on canvas. I recognized most of the faces from previous events Sophie had dragged me to, back when she still pretended I was worth being seen with. Mrs. Barlow was holding court near the main display, surrounded by admirers and sycophants. She looked older than when I'd seen her last, worn down by the stress of discovering that her protege had been betraying her. Sophie and Ethan arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that drew attention from across the room. Sophie was wearing a black dress that clung to her curves, her hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She looked beautiful and confident and completely unaware that she was walking into a trap. I waited until they'd had time to work the room, greeting friends and clients, rebuilding their network of lies. Then I made my move. "Excuse me," I said, approaching Mrs. Barlow's group. "Could I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" The conversation died as faces turned toward me. I saw Sophie across the room, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she realized what was happening. "My name is Danny Chen," I continued. "Some of you know me as Sophie's husband. I have something I think you all need to see." I pulled out the portfolio and opened it to the first page, a photograph of Sophie and Ethan kissing in the alley behind Chez Laurent. "This is my wife with her business partner, Ethan Morrison. They've been having an affair for the past 8 months, but that's not why I'm here tonight." Sophie was pushing through the crowd toward me, her face pale with panic. Ethan was right behind her, his hand reaching inside his jacket like he was going for a tool. "I'm here because they've been stealing from Mrs. Barlow, and from all of you." I flipped to the next page, financial records showing duplicate sales of the same pieces to different buyers. This painting was sold to 3 different collectors in the same month. This sculpture was authenticated with forged documents. This gallery has been running a sophisticated fraud operation, and Mrs. Barlow had no idea. The crowd was buzzing now, voices rising in confusion and anger. Mrs. Barlow looked like she was going to faint. "Danny, stop this." Sophie had reached the front of the group, her composure finally cracking. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" I flipped to another page. "Here's an email from you to Ethan discussing how to frame Mrs. Barlow for the fraud. Quote, 'The old witch will take the fall and will be free to start over somewhere else.' End quote. That's fabricated. He's lying." But the damage was done. I could see it in the faces around me: doubt, suspicion, the gradual realization that they'd been taken for fools. These were people who prided themselves on their sophistication, their ability to spot quality and authenticity. Learning they'd been conned by a gallery manager and her lawyer boyfriend was worse than losing money. It was humiliation. Ethan finally reached us, his face flushed with anger and fear. "This is harassment. Sophie, we don't have to listen to this." "Actually, you do," I smiled at him, "because I've sent copies of everything to the police, the FBI's art fraud division, and the insurance companies that covered the stolen pieces. Oh, and to the Massachusetts Bar Association, since I'm pretty sure lawyers aren't supposed to help their girlfriends commit felonies. That's when Ethan made his mistake. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep hard enough to leave bruises. "You son of a witch. You've ruined everything." I looked down at his hand, then back at his face. "You might want to let go of me, Ethan, unless you want to add assault to your list of problems." "Danny, please," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "We can work this out. We can fix this." "No, Sophie, we can't. You made your choice when you threw my anniversary gift in the trash. Everything that's happened since then has just been consequences." Security was moving through the crowd now, along with what looked like police officers. Someone had called the authorities, probably Mrs. Barlow or one of the collectors who'd realized they'd been defrauded. Ethan released my arm and stepped back, his lawyer instincts finally kicking in. "Sophie, don't say anything else. We need to leave, now." But it was too late for running. The police were at the exits, and the crowd had formed a circle around us like spectators at a gladiator fight. "Mrs. Barlow," I said, turning to the old woman, "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but I thought you deserved to know the truth before they disappeared with whatever money they haven't already stolen." Mrs. Barlow looked at Sophie with an expression of profound betrayal. "Is it true? All of it?" Sophie opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came out. The evidence was overwhelming, and we all knew it. "I trusted you," Mrs. Barlow whispered. "I treated you like family. Eleanor, I can explain." "No, you can't. There's no explanation for this kind of betrayal." The police were moving in now, and I could see handcuffs glinting in the gallery lights. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more card to play. "Oh, and Sophie," I called out as the officers approached her, "that sculpture you threw in the trash? The one you sold for $12,000? I made copies, lots of copies. They're going to be displayed in a group show next month at the community college. The theme is Art from the Heart, local craftsmen and their stories." Her face crumpled as she realized the final insult. Her husband's worthless craftwork was going to outlast her career in the art world. "The title of the piece is Anniversary Gift," I continued, "and the artist's statement explains how it was inspired by my wife's betrayal. I think it's going to be very popular with local collectors who appreciate authentic work." That's when Sophie finally broke down completely, sobbing, as the police led her away in handcuffs. Ethan was right behind her, his expensive suit wrinkled and his silver hair disheveled. The crowd began to disperse, people talking in hushed voices about what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Barlow was surrounded by friends and advisors, no doubt beginning the long process of damage control and recovery. I stood alone in the center of the gallery, surrounded by the wreckage of Sophie's carefully constructed world. 10 years of marriage, reduced to a criminal case and a newspaper headline. Ray appeared at my elbow, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "Jesus, Danny, you really did it." "Yeah, I did." "How do you feel?" I looked around at the chaos I'd created. The destroyed careers, the ruined reputations, the lives turned upside down by the revelation of truth. "Like I finally know who I am," I said. Ray slapped me on the back. "Come on, let's get out of here. First round's on me." As we walked toward the exit, I caught a glimpse of myself in one of the gallery's mirrors. I looked different somehow, harder, more focused, like a man who'd discovered he was capable of things he'd never imagined. Sophie had wanted a villain? Well, congratulations, I'd just given her an original.